Venomous Stare back with another Venomous Classic, the series in which I take a look back at classic StarCraft 2 games that are too good to only be casted once. These are the games that had a significant impact on the game's history and on certain players' career paths. And this time we have the IPL Season 1 finals between the Root Macro Protoss, Root Kiwikaki, Jonathan Greneau, who now plays poker professionally, and Greg IdrA Fields, the infallible macro machine. This game was played in late 2011, and it's a culmination of an online tournament called the IPL, which, if you're not familiar with the IPL, it's the IGN Pro League. IGN, of course, is a website that is basically just like a gaming website. But back in the day when StarCraft 2 was really poppin', they held their own league, and it was extremely interesting. And this was the culmination of the first season. Kiwikaki versus IdrA. Now we need to talk about the players because it's 2019 when I cast this video. We can look here. It's January 30th, 2019. So this game happened almost 8 years ago. So why am I cataloging these games? Why am I focusing on old games when new games exist? The answer is very simple. I care greatly about the history of the game, specifically the history of my favorite player ever, Greg IdrA Fields, and I want to go back and make sure that the history of him as a pro gamer is cataloged properly. I cast the wins, I cast the losses, I'm intellectually honest about balance, I'm intellectually honest about IdrA's flaws as a player. And if you're interested in these older games, you can check out the Venomous Classic playlist. The link will be in the description. Another thing that will be in the description is the source files for these videos. Now granted, it is very hard to find these videos, and that is a huge reason why I do the Venomous Classic series. If you're a newer player that wants to go back in time and look at old VODs and try to figure out how good a player actually was, or how players played in a certain metagame, or even just who won a certain tournament, the fact of the matter is that's not very easy to do. And since Husky StarCraft deleted his channel without warning, a huge amount of old VODs are gone, and it's very hard for the newer fan to try to dip their toe into these old school games. So as someone who really cared about the game and wasn't just doing it for the CPM like Husky, I wanted to make an effort to cast these older games, specifically regarding my favorite player ever, Greg IdrA Fields in the top right here. IdrA, of course, known for his demonstrative, hold nothing back personality. This is the sort of guy who would tell you what he was feeling all the time. He wasn't going to bullshit with you. He wasn't going to pull punches. He wasn't going to be politically correct. This was an honest guy who always called them like he saw them. And that's the exact same way that I try to cast. I just try to be honest all the time. A lot of times when you watch these WCS casts or these professional casted games, the casters are going to blow smoke up your ass. They're going to pretend that engagements that have absolutely one way of ending, they're going to pretend those engagements can end in multiple ways. They're going to pretend that every player is GSL caliber, every player is this master, just absolute legend. And if they're making a mistake, it must be because they're planning something. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to call them straight up, and I'm going to tell you exactly what's going on, and I'm not going to pull any punches, because Blizzard's not paying me to pretend like everything's balanced. Speaking of balanced, this is 2011. This wasn't exactly regarded as a time that was very well balanced. This was the latter half of 2011, which, if you look at the history of StarCraft 2 and look at when the viewership was the highest and the interest in the game was really popping off, I would say from about the latter half, meaning, like July and onwards of 2011, up until about the middle of 2012 was the peak of the game's life. back in 2010 when the game first came out, there was a little bit more new viewer excitement. But in terms of people who were actually invested into the game and really cared about it, outside of just, I heard of StarCraft 1 and that's like a really popular game, and I hear StarCraft 2's coming out, I guess I'll be interested in that and buy it and play a few matches. See, the difference between that and someone who was actually interested in StarCraft 2 was the difference between 2010 and 2011. Because by 2011, anyone who had just installed StarCraft 2 because, it's really popular and I sort of want to fit in, those people had fallen out of the wayside. Those people had gone away. You know, the sort of person who hears a new computer game or a new Xbox game is coming out and acts like they're super interested, and then, buys the game but doesn't actually play it. That's the people who pretended they were interested in StarCraft in 2010. And by 2011, that didn't really exist so much. It was more of the hardcore fan. We can see a basic 4 warp gate opener was chosen by Kiwikaki here, and he of course took an expansion behind it, went for a bit of a Sentry Zealot pressure. Now there are a few things worth noting here. A, this is Xel'Naga Caverns, an incredibly open map. This was a map that Zerg players would often open Speedling Expand on, just because they would be able to threaten the base of Protoss. It's a very open natural. Normally when you see maps now, the Protoss player is able to wall in with a handful of buildings. But on this map, wide open, it's very good for Zerg aggression, and it's difficult for TOS to take their natural. So what you saw in this was a lot of one base aggression, like we just saw from Kiwikaki, who was essentially just doing a one base all-in 4-gate, but he just took a Nexus behind it. And now he's going into Robo. We also saw this on a game that IdrA played against Ryan State Fizbeck, who is a relatively talented American Protoss player who traveled over to Korea in 2014, 2015, and basically fizzled out and was never heard from again. And State essentially would go for a 4 warp gate rush using a pylon on the low ground, which of course the pylon was always put around the lower part of the gold third base. It's very interesting to look back at classic StarCraft 2, where proxy pylons were a huge part of the metagame, because whenever you put a pylon down, gateway units would warp in within 4 seconds no matter what. You didn't have to have a gateway attached. So essentially what you saw is very frequently in this matchup, Protoss players would attempt to hide pylons all over the map. Speaking of hide, IdrA's going to run in here with burrowed roaches, but there's an observer out, and Kiwikaki has multiple force fields. He's retreating here behind his mineral line, throwing force fields up, preventing the roaches from unburrowing, and he's going to throw a few more up. That was a huge observer from Kiwikaki, as IdrA was really expecting Kiwikaki to not be ready. He was behind after the early game, and we're going to go into game 2 here. We're going to jump right in. So essentially what happened in that game is that Kiwikaki attacked IdrA in the early game with a Zealot Sentry move out with a base behind it. IdrA held, and then he made a few workers and then did a huge 2-base roach all-in with burrow. And essentially what the Zerg player was relying on was for the roaches to burrow all the way under the sentries without the Protoss knowing, to pop up, kill everything, laugh the Protoss out of the game, and win. However, Kiwikaki went into that quick robo, and what we basically saw was the fact that IdrA went for a build that relied on his opponent not having detection, and because Kiwikaki had detection and microed perfectly, constantly kiting back, throwing down force fields onto the approaching roaches, basically where the roaches were, not where they were trying to unburrow, But where they were, it meant that the Roaches just kept having to run more forward and more forward until the point where IdrA had like essentially run from he had burrowed from outside of Kiwi's ramp, and by the time he unburrowed, he was behind his mineral line at his natural. So he had just taken an insane amount of damage, and make no mistake, that was a pure and unadulterated sneak attack from IdrA. There was not a lot of background to that build. There wasn't a backup plan. There wasn't something IdrA could do to sort of come back. He invested everything he had into that burrowed roach play. And for Kiwikaki to just slap it aside that easily is a huge deal. So let's talk about Kiwikaki. Since this is a best of 5, I didn't do the usual caster thing of telling both players' stories right at the beginning. Kiwikaki is a guy from Canada, Jonathan Greneau, who had a lot of success at the beginning of the game's life. And he was a guy who took advantage of the fact that people were still learning StarCraft 2 when it first came out. As we see, IdrA is going for a Speedling Expand, and Kiwikaki is trying to go for a Forge Opener here. And if you don't know, on this map back in the day, there was a very common strategy that Protoss players would do, which was just a basically cannon rush with wall in. And what happened is that Zerg players, because there was not a ramp on this map, except, obviously there's a ramp somewhere on the map, but since the ramp wasn't sort of at the natural, dividing the main and natural, Protoss players would just do this really easy cannon rush where they would wall Zerg in. And this was something that we saw MC do to IdrA in a tournament at an MLG back in the day. And I remember back in the day, it was like every few months there would be a new MLG, and it was so exciting. You would get to see the best Korean players play the best foreigners, and frequently I went to those MLGs. I would go to MLG Dallas every year that they had it, and I would get to meet and see my favorite pro gamers. Now this, of course, is completely different than how it is now, where essentially you're lucky just to get BlizzCon's gonna happen. Okay, that's in California, so that's a very expensive trip, and you sort of put yourself in this position as Blizzard where there's your odd IEM, there might be a home story cup, but it's just not the same. If you weren't around at this time, back in 2011, there was a major tournament every weekend. There was MLG Dallas, MLG DC, MLG Orlando, IPL Season 1, which is what we're watching now, the IGN Pro League Finals. There was a lot of other stuff, the North American Star League, GSL, which of course still exists, but most of that stuff is gone. IPL, gone. The VODs from the website, scrubbed. MLG, same deal. As far as StarCraft 2 goes, gone. Okay. In ASL, same deal. Scrub the VODs from their website, and they don't do tournaments anymore. So what does that leave us? Well, that leaves us with some of the official Blizzard-sponsored stuff, which is few and far between. And it, of course, leaves us with GSL, which is the best Korean tournament in the world, but does not exactly showcase how foreigner players best interact with the non-Korean players. And my Spotify is completely bugged, completely crashed, can't change this song. You pay $12 a month for something and it's fucking worthless. That's pretty much an allegory for the current day American. And we're going to see IdrA here basically went for a one base Roachling all-in. This is classic Greg IdrA Fields. He might be known as the consummate macro player, but when this guy thought he was behind, he was just as likely to all-in as the rest of them. And this is something that's going to be very exciting to look for as this series goes on, because IdrA, even though his nickname is the Macro Machine, and even though he's generally regarded as a hard macro player, almost being one-dimensional in many regards, we see matches like this where he actually goes for an extremely polarizing cheese where he cancels his hatchery. And at this point, he's dead. He has less workers than the Protoss, less bases than the Protoss, less tech than the Protoss. You know, there's really no way for IdrA to win here. He's down 13 workers to 20. There's 4 cannons up at the front door of Kiwikaki. He's walled in. And this was something that you saw a lot in the early days of StarCraft 2. If Zerg was behind, they might get a little frustrated and go completely all in. And it was not hard for Protoss or Terran to just defend, because Zerg didn't have the Ravager. The Roach was a worse unit. There weren't as many options to go into from layer tech. The Nidus Worm was worse. So you have situations like this where IdrA sort of perceived that he was behind and put everything he had into attacking. And now we're seeing a game where Kiwikaki is insanely far ahead, and IdrA is in this position where he felt very far behind, and he did everything he could to basically shove all of his resources into one big attack. And it didn't do very much damage. Make no mistake about it, IdrA is very far behind. He is behind by 9 workers, which is just repulsive if you're Zerg. You always want to be about a handful of workers ahead when you're Zerg. So to sit there and be behind as Zerg is almost as disgusting as to pay over $10 a month for Spotify and have the app completely lock up mid-cast. Kiwi is going to go for a robo here, and it looks as though as he's trying to take multiple bases, IdrA is making a roach. Now he's going to make a few drones. Robo about halfway done for Kiwikaki. And with 4 cannons, 5 cannons out in the front side of the base here for Kiwi, basically any sort of front-loaded aggression IdrA wants to do is going to be nullified. One thing that you have to note about this tournament is it is best of 5 and Kiwi is up 1-0. So if Kiwi wins this, he will be up 2-0. And considering IdrA's third just came up, he's behind by 10 workers. I really don't foresee Kiwi losing this game. Remember, back in this time, in 2010, and frankly, even throughout his entire career, if IdrA fell behind, if he was in a position where it looked like he was going to lose and then he lost, and he was behind in the series, it was generally sort of agreed upon that IdrA would tilt. He would become frustrated, maybe he would do some cheese builds, maybe he would make some inadequate decisions or leave games early, or do builds that it didn't seem like he really would want to do in a normal game. And this was a stigma that stuck with IdrA for basically his whole career. And his detractors would frequently say things like, oh yeah, like when IdrA loses the first game, he's completely fucked, he just tilts off the face of the earth. And all you really need to do against IdrA is, do some crazy cheese to win the first game, and shoot, once you've won the first game, IdrA's going to tilt and you're going to lose. And if you look at IdrA's win-loss percentage on the games in which he lost the first game of a best of 3 or a best of 5, as opposed to the games where he won, it was a very staggering percentage. IdrA would almost always win when he took the early advantage and would seemingly always lose whenever he got to a disadvantage. Now this was one of those things that even though it was sort of backed up by numbers, any logical person would have sat there and asked themselves, well, what's the average winning percentage of someone who loses the first game of a best of 3? Like if you lose a best of 3, if you lose game 1 of a best of 3, like aren't you really likely to lose the best of 3? And I don't feel like that's something that was appropriately talked about enough during IdrA's reign. It was sort of just, people would just, almost like it was a meme, they would just write him off. Oh, IdrA lost. He's going to go on tilt. He's going to be angry. He's going to be upset. He's so predictable. He might even be so mad that he just cheeses and flips coins. And throughout his career, this is something I paid really close attention to. When IdrA got behind, as someone who really liked and cared about IdrA, I would always think, oh, is he just going to do a cheese this game? What is he going to do in game 2? Is he going to get frustrated and just go all in? Or is he going to try to play his typical methodical macro style? And if you watch interviews with IdrA, shockingly, he wouldn't even say, oh yeah, I'm a macro player. I just go for macro games every time. He would say, essentially, I think I'm the best player. And the way that the superior player wins in StarCraft is a macro game, which is true. If you look at a macro game versus a cheese game, the longer the game goes, the better the macro player becomes. And this is sort of a classic old adage in StarCraft 2, is that the longer the game goes, the better the macro player is. So IdrA, according to himself, would primarily try to play macro games because he thought he was the better player, not necessarily the macro player. 2 Colossus out here for Kiwi, and he will easily push IdrA off of his third. So it's something that's very interesting to me. Whenever IdrA goes down in a series, does he just follow it up by being very aggressive, by going all in, by getting frustrated, by playing poorly? Or is it more of a, oh, I think my best chance of winning is to cheese this guy? If you look at IdrA's series in 2011, GSL Code S January, he played Genro in the round of 8. And after going down 2-1 in the series, after winning the first game, IdrA 6-pooled. He 6-pooled drone rushed on Jungle Basin, and a lot of people sort of said, oh, this is a perfect example of IdrA getting frustrated and just sort of giving up. No, that wasn't the case. He always planned to 6-pool on that map, and he's always planning to snipe down Colossus with Corruptors. This was a very common strategy for the 2011 time period for Zerg, as well as something that IdrA stuck to longer than most Zergs. This Roach Corruptor or Roach Hydra Corruptor macro style was very popular because Zerg players really needed an answer to the Colossus, and it was very difficult for them to figure out. The fact that you were supposed to just go mass Ling Infestor wasn't something that was figured out until mid-2012. Now you might even be thinking to yourself, well, how are you supposed to go Ling Infestor versus Colossus? Well, back in this day, the Infestor was much more powerful. But frequently you saw Zerg players going for these much more sturdy, sort of predictable compositions. And you can see the weakness of these compositions here, as a plethora of Colossus are out here for Kiwikaki. And all it took was just a few force fields, and all of a sudden IdrA is at a huge disadvantage. He's remaxing on units that he basically has no intention of winning with, because you make Roach Corruptor versus upgraded Stalker Sentry Colossus, and at the time that might have felt like the right thing to do, but without the Ravager, there's no answer to the Sentry, to the force field, so it's very easy for the Protoss. Just look at that. Those aren't even good force fields, There's 3 of them, there's a huge gap in one, and the other one's overlapping. But Kiwikaki is just going to laugh IdrA out of the game here, because IdrA essentially committed an insane amount to Roach Corruptor, and even if IdrA cleans up this one little assault, he's still going to lose. Kiwikaki's on a tremendous economy, a much bigger economy than IdrA, and he's on much better tech. He's going into Mothership. He already has robotic support bay, and even though IdrA did try to go for the Infestor, which, believe me, was not nearly as popular as it would become, and was virtually just seen as a spellcaster that many Zergs would sort of use fungal once and just suicide because they weren't hotkeying as well as they should have been able to. But it doesn't matter. IdrA made Roach Corruptor versus Stalker Colossus. He macroed reasonably well, but against Sentry, it just wasn't enough. The Sentry was just insanely powerful. And this was a big reason that we saw the Zerg players sort of go into double upgrade Ling Infestor instead of these Roach Hydra based styles. Because in many ways, the Roach Corruptor / Hydra style can just be run over by just a few decent force fields and a couple Colossus. And God forbid if they make Storm. That was like the great forgotten Protoss weapon in this time, was making Storm. And we can see IdrA, he's trying to force field, he's trying to fungal growth Kiwikaki here, but he's virtually mined out. Kiwikaki essentially, he's been macroing decently, but in terms of what we would see in modern Protoss macro, this was essentially one Warp Prism away from being game over, because Kiwikaki had just had a ton of money the whole time, and he was doing what I like to call playing a MOBA game, which is when you get way too focused on just microing your current set of units instead of constantly reproducing. Because in StarCraft, the game is actually more about reproducing, macroing, and getting more money than it is actually micromanagement and looking at your units for an extended period of time. It might seem weird to players, especially Terran players who love marine splitting, but the point is if all Kiwi had to do was make a Warp Prism and warp in 12 charge lots, and he would have face rolled IdrA 3 minutes ago. But back in this time, the Warp Prism was not used as much. People did not really understand how exceptionally powerful it was. As we see Kiwi picking off IdrA's base here, and IdrA's in dire straits. Kiwi knows about the bottom middle base and the top base, the sort of top right third that IdrA took. That's just way close to Kiwi's main area. We can see Kiwi has already taken a 5th base, and IdrA's in this position where he's constantly defending with units that don't really transition well into the mid-late game. Roach Infestor, the average player who has only heard horror stories about Infestors might be saying, oh, he's making Infestors, how could he lose? Well, Roaches are still Roaches, and IdrA just leaves there without GG, so IdrA's down 2-0, and we're going into Game 3. So with IdrA down 2-0, you have to consider the fact that all of his detractors are thinking that he's done. They're thinking IdrA's rage quit. This is the guy who he's just going to do some half-ass cheese. He's going to 6-pool or something. He's going to get it over with. And we're going to see if that is the case. And remember, guys, Jonathan Kiwikaki Greneau, back in 2010 and 2011, was considered a top-tier foreigner Protoss, and almost in the same way that Neeb is now. He was one of these guys that he was actually good enough to fuck with the Koreans. He was that powerful. And this game is going to be on, this is either Lost or Shattered. It's Shattered Temple. Lost Temple and Shattered Temple are basically the same map. Lost Temple just has a obnoxious cliff as opposed to rocks. Lost Temple is actually way harder for Zerg than Shattered Temple. But funnily enough, Lost Temple was in the pool for a long time and was sort of even considered like, oh yeah, it's this classic Brood War map everyone likes. And then Blizzard sat there and basically said, oh well, it turns out dropping stuff on the natural of Zerg with the cliff is a little too strong. And then they took like a year and made Shattered Temple, which was still sort of bad for Zerg. Basically, they only did away with the cliff, but the map still had all of the problems of close positions and everything else. Back in this time in 2011, it was this weird period where everyone knew that being able to wall Zerg in by making structures at the bottom of the ramp, whether it be 2 bunkers or 3 pylons, was too powerful. and they also knew that spawning in close by grounds positions was too powerful, but Blizzard just didn't do anything about it. So you saw these maps like MLG Shattered Temple, ESC Cloud Kingdom, essentially just fan-made edits of maps, which in many cases, half of those maps, like Cloud Kingdom, they were already fan-made. But they incorporated force cross-spawn positions and a neutral depot at the base of the ramp to prevent Zerg from just getting basically auto loss by 3 pylons. Now, if you follow the Venomous Classic series extensively, then you know that back in the day of 2010, you didn't even need 3 pylons to wall Zerg in. All you needed was 2. Protoss would just open with an early forge, find the Zerg, wall them in, and even if the Zerg went pool first, they wouldn't be able to stop this cheese, and they would essentially just be relegated to try to Baneling bust out of their own ramp just to take their natural. Now, the game wasn't as bad at this time back in 2011 as opposed to 2010, but I mean, it was about that bad. Because if you consider the fact the game had been out for over a year and Blizzard hadn't done anything about close spawns, they hadn't done anything about neutral depot, they had been relying on the community members to sort of fix the maps, and a lot of times what would happen was, like in this game, the people who were hosting the tournament would just pick the standard official Blizzard approved Lost Temple, Shattered Temple, and because Blizzard was so sort of belligerent and idiotic with the way that they were handling the map pool, you would have these really stupid fluky games. A lot of times you would have sort of normal games like this. But then you would have games like IdrA versus MVP, you know, GSL 2010. And this was a game where essentially the best foreign player was playing against the best Korean player. And in that map, or in that series, you had both Blistering Sands, Steps of War, and Close Positions Metalopolis being played. Now, I know that might be pure French to some of you new players, but let me make this very obvious. Steps of War is the smallest map ever played in StarCraft II competitive history. It is incredibly bad for Zerg, because even if Zerg has a Ling right at the base of the main ramp of the non-Zerg player, you know what that means? Well, it means that even if Zerg sees the move out right when it happens, they can even have a damn Zergling made by the time the attack hits. Obviously, detrimental. You look at Lost Temple, cliff over the base, you can spawn close positions. There's a lot of little abusive spots just in general. It's not a good map for Zerg. The third is covered by rocks. Any map where the third is covered by rocks is just inherently bad for Zerg, and let me explain why. Ideally, Zerg wants to be pumping pure drones until they get about 85 workers. Now, obviously, they're not going to be able to do that in almost every game, but that's the gist of Zerg. That's what makes Zerg different from the other races. The other races can make workers out of their main base, and then they can make attacking units out of barracks and gateways and robos. It's not that way for Zerg. Zerg is restricted by their hatcheries. Their hatcheries bottleneck their production, and it looks as though IdrA is going for a Roach Ling all in here as he has cut workers at 22. And this is exceptionally interesting. IdrA's down 2-0 on a map where he hasn't been dropped, and he's going to go for an all-in. The Lings are going to surround the sentries. The sentries are throwing up average force fields. The Roaches are flooding forward here. The Robo just now comes up, and on a relatively open base, as far as the natural goes, Kiwikaki is going to be pressured badly here. As we can see, Kiwikaki made almost everything inside his base or not on his wall. He was virtually just inviting a Roach Ling all-in to occur. He made 3 pylons for SimCity, no cannons, nothing else. Didn't put his Robo in the wall. Didn't put his extra gates in the wall. Just stamped a big old forehead on his sign that said, "Hey Greg, please all in me. Just please all in me. You know, I'm not going to respect you at all. I'm just going to assume you're going to take a third. And what we saw there from IdrA is it sort of looked like, in some ways, it looked like he was going to take a third. He was killing his rocks. But if you paid close attention to the production tab, he was pumping pure roach ling off of 2 bases. He was very dedicated to breaking the Protoss. And I'm not trying to root against IdrA, but I would really hate to think what would have happened if Kiwikaki had just made a couple cannons or made his gateway in his Sim City. Making 3 pylons and nothing else to protect a choke that wide is pretty greedy. And to be honest, that is the sort of thing that Protoss players had to do for Zerg to win in certain situations and in certain maps. I'm not going to sugarcoat it or be intellectually dishonest. Kiwikaki very easily could have won that game with just a very simple change of Sim City. There was no reason to go all the way up to 60 supply or whatever it was, with pylons not in the correct position. We saw in the other games, like on Tal'Darim Halter, all it takes is a wall-in and a sentry. Zergs don't have Ravager. I don't know how many times I have to restate that, but it's so important. If Zerg does a big attack in the early game with roaches and it fails, they are dead. They are too far behind to recover. Oftentimes they don't have lair, that means no roach speed or any other tech. Oftentimes they don't have Evo chamber, the building required to make spore crawlers back in this time. If you went for a big 2-base roachling all in and failed, it was massive. It wasn't like now where Zergs fail a roachling all in and they say to themselves, oh, I guess I'll make a few Ravagers and fuck the Protoss anyway. No, it doesn't work like that. A roachling all in was a roachling all in. And last game, even though IdrA did a good job of sort of hiding what he was doing by pretending like he was interested in taking the third, he hit Kiwikaki right in the mouth and he won the game. Now it's sort of interesting to note, yeah, IdrA was down 0-2 and he went for a cheese build and killed his opponent. Because whenever you look at the history of IdrA and how people sort of portray him, the old narrative, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is, oh, if IdrA falls behind, he's going to get frustrated and he's not going to give a fuck. He's going to early leave games. He's going to go for stupid cheeses that he would never go for normally. Yada, yada, yada. But last game, we saw a great roachling all in from IdrA, and it was a very interesting contrast from the narrative that we always hear applied to him. Even IdrA's own friends, even the people that IdrA played with in his formative years would always say things like, yeah, IdrA plays like a robot. He does the same thing every game. He's not a particularly creative player. He's, in general, going to go for the same sort of strategy. And we can see Kiwikaki there went for a delayed cannon rush. And that's one of those things where if the Zerg goes hatch first, they're certainly not expecting it because you already sent the probe across the map and they killed the probe. And the average Zerg player is going to be thinking to themselves, okay, well, I got the probe, I don't have to worry about cannon rush. But Kiwikaki tried to be sneaky and get a pylon into IdrA's natural without him noticing. Thankfully, IdrA was diligent with the Zerglings and was able to scout that. Now, it's worth noting IdrA went pool first as opposed to hatchery first, which is a variety of Zerg macro opener that does in fact counter cannon rush. But IdrA successfully has his natural expansion up, and he has been delayed way less than he has in the other games. This is something that we saw much more frequently in the early days of StarCraft 2 as opposed to the middle and later days of StarCraft 2, which is the gateway opener zealot aggression. Think of this as the Oracle for its day. This is something that you did as Protoss, where you could catch your Zerg opponent off guard and really cause a lot of damage if they weren't ready for it. But IdrA, it looks like, with perfect micro, he's going to be reasonably ready for it. That one creep tumor goes down. He has both the queens, which of course had a repulsive 3 range, which was basically good for nothing, pound away at the zealots, and then he had the zerglings trap them to prevent himself from being kited. Now he's in this weird position where he needs more zerglings to defend, but he doesn't just want to flood a bunch of zerglings and screw up his drone count. So he's going to make a little bit of each. He's going to retreat the queen back, get 1 zealot, get 2 zealot, and it looks like he's going to clean up the attack. And he's still behind in workers, which pretty much says all that needs to be said about the game in this state. Because Kiwikaki basically went for like an early game pressure build, failed completely, literally did 0 damage, and he's still ahead. You know, that might be a talking point for minds greater than myself, but to think about the fact that IdrA had that huge pressure literally in his base, and he was actively making drones while it happened, and he was about to die, and he's still down on workers. I mean, I don't know how you see that as a fan of the game and say that that was how it was supposed to be. But in this time, Zerg had to put up with a lot of bullshit. You had to have way more skill and way more observational ability to play Zerg in this time. And conversely, and this might piss people off, but you had to have less skill to play Protoss. And I don't know why that would make people angry, because that just means that every Protoss player nowadays is just better, and they had to have more skill to play their race and execute these builds. But in a map pool with an excruciatingly high amount of crushing choke points, close positions, no neutral ramp, lots of just small cramped maps that were bad for Zerg, and no Ravager, it was very difficult for Zerg to deal with, because there were a plethora of strategies the Protoss could go with, but they would frequently go for these sentry heavy openers, and if you didn't kill them early on, then they would do these big sentry push outs that would just devastate you. And it's very hard to kill an opponent who's playing safe and has made sentries. Remember, the sentry counters cheese. It counters Baneling Bust, it counters Roach Bust, it counters Ling Flood. The force field back in this day was god tier. The force field already is exceptionally powerful, but in this day, holy crap, the force field was good. And we can see Kiwikaki here somehow butchered his wall to the extent where he's having to kill his own buildings on more than one occasion. And you know, I'm not going to be overcritical, but that's 2011 for you. Like, players are killing their own damn cyber cores to get out of their wall. I mean, that's just ridiculous. And it looks like IdrA, with his Overlord Scout, sees the 4 gates in the main, so he can sort of deduce that this is an all-in. Now, back in the day, there were way more sort of 2-base fast gateway all-ins like this, because, like I said, you could just warp in off a 4-second pylon. So you would get in these positions where the Zerg would be ready, he would pump Roach Ling for 4 straight minutes, and you could just win anyway. And it looks like IdrA, a very common tactic against these builds was to try to sneak in with the Roaches, hope your opponent was literally brain dead, and snipe all the sentries. Now, of course, this was one of the only ways you could hold some of these pushes, but in a very laughable, sort of dim-witted comedic way, any moron could throw up half-decent enough force fields not to get their fucking army wiped when you surprise them, so that was just sort of something that was weird about this era. You would get these Protoss players who would just do ridiculous 2-base all-ins, but couldn't execute them even a lick. I'm sort of puzzled as to why the Protoss just isn't taking a third. Okay, it looks like he is. There it is, there's the third. So essentially what you saw was Kiwikaki went for what was like essentially a scuffed 2011 version of the 6-base, the 6 gate plus 1 2-base all-in with gateway units. But he ended up going into a macro game with Colossus. And IdrA's clearing out the rocks here. Now if you notice the exceptionally small area in the chokes where the rocks used to be, even though Shakura's Plateau, which is what we're watching now, was at one point considered to be like quote unquote like a good map or a macro map, it turns out that it was actually just really small and really shitty like a lot of the other maps. At least you couldn't spawn top left versus bottom left. You could spawn the other close positions, but you couldn't actually spawn vertical of each other. And we can see here IdrA is just desperately trying to kill the third. Now the mindset you have here as Zerg is, I'm on shitty roaches, I have a big economy and a lot of money. If I can sacrifice these roaches, even though there are a lot of them, to delay the third, then I'm just going to keep making my advantage increase. It looks as though IdrA has gone for drop play here. Now IdrA's drop play is very uncommon. Back in this time, drop you had to get 100-100 for speed, and you had to get 200-200 for the drop itself, and it was hidden behind layer. So this was a strategy that you didn't see hardly ever. And I remember IdrA talking about the strategy in this particular game, where he essentially said that he was intentionally trying to force Kiwikaki to multitask, because he didn't say this part, but he was under the impression that if I just attack one front, any idiot can just hit their force fields and destroy my roach army with their Colossus. But if I have a overlord over his natural and an overlord over his main and just fucking drop hydras or roaches into his bases while I do this aggression, then he's going to take damage, because Protoss players aren't used to multitasking. And we can see here 2 cannons behind the mineral line of Kiwi. And remember, there have been no mutas shown, there's no spire. This is purely a cannon entrenchment to try to counter what IdrA has been doing. And this is the difference between someone who just runs through their motions and does the same ladder builds over and over, and someone who actually thinks and tries to be a cerebral RTS player. As Kiwikaki is trying to defend his ramp, and he is continuously being flanked from his main and his natural, it has really cut into his gas count and what he's able to produce. And even though IdrA cleans up all of the Colossus in the middle, Kiwikaki will hold this initial push. But we can see IdrA is just continuously harassing the mineral lines of Kiwi with both roach and hydra drops. And I really can't emphasize enough how rare this is. It's not like once IdrA did this in the IPL finals, this was like a big Zerg deal, and it's not like IdrA continuously did this as a staple of his play even afterwards. IdrA definitely was saying, I don't think Kiwikaki is that good, and I'm going to force him to multitask, and that's how I'm going to get him on the ropes, and that's how I'm going to get him feeling vulnerable. And without any Colossus and 5 base economy here for IdrA, roaches stream across the map and really start to do game-ending damage for Kiwi. Kiwi was clearly thrown off by the excessive attacking of the dropper lords. And I'll say again, IdrA had to get a 200 upgrade to even do this. This isn't the current day horseshit overlord where you just make a fucking 25 investment and all of a sudden you can harass. And that's the last game from fucking Kiwi. So we're going to an ace match. This is game 5 of the first ever IGN Pro League Finals. Now remember, this was one of the premier tournaments back in the day. This was right up there with MLG. This was right up there with IEM. This was right up there with NASL. And it was just a step below GSL. You had some real heavy hitters in this tournament, and it was something that was to be appreciated. And I can't fix the green box here, and I have absolutely no fucking idea why it exists, but that's just the fact of the matter. So in this best of 5, Kiwikaki and IdrA will face off. They're tied 2-2. And whoever wins this takes the prize money, and they take a whole hell of a lot of praise. And it's going to be on this map, Terminus. And if you weren't familiar with the early days of StarCraft 2, I'm sure that I've taught you a couple lessons if you've been watching the whole cast. But in the same way that Close Positions Lost Temple and Steps of War and these other shit tier maps were sort of openly imbalanced and people knew it was horse shit, tournament organizers were put in a position where Blizzard would release the official map pool and it would be half garbage. Like half straight up garbage. You couldn't play like steps and fucking blistering sands and all this other nonsensical garbage. But what you also saw was these sort of mid-range maps that people didn't want to play because they either had imbalances on them, like close positions or not having depot at the base of the ramp, or some other positional imbalance. So tournament organizers were put in this shitty spot where they were in a position where the pro gamers didn't want to play the fucking ladder map pool because it was a joke. A little bit tired here, sorry guys, it's really late. So you had maps like Terminus, which didn't ever really have any significant impact on your average ladder player, but if you were a pro gamer, Terminus was in the map pool for a while. On some level, tournaments finally said like, oh, we're tired of having these illegitimate joke matches where it's close positions and it's, you know, cannon rush at the bottom of ramp, it's double bunker at the bottom of ramp. Like, when people saw MVP and IdrA, two legends of their time, face off against each other, they didn't want 2 out of those 3 matches to be completely decided by map. You know, whenever a StarCraft fan watches a StarCraft game, they want to see the best player win. They want to see the player with the most talent succeed. They don't want to see a game where there's a 1 in 3 chance where someone spawns with a nearly insurmountable disadvantage. That's a joke. No one gives a shit about that. And on many levels, this is something that Blizzard didn't realize. Blizzard had their thumb up their ass as usual. And the funny thing about Blizzard and their lack of action, specifically in the first 3 years of the game's life, examples, close position spawn maps, no depot at the base of ramp maps, the infestor running rampant as far as being imbalanced, all Blizzard did was nothing. Blizzard sat there and did nothing about these issues until it was to the point where you already had people quit because of it. Now, what do I mean by that? I know that sounds sort of obscure for some people, but about halfway through 2012, the infestor was insanely powerful, and the only legitimate Zerg macro strategy that was able to be executed at the time was basically double upgrade Ling Infestor, but specifically you really wanted to target the Infestor as your money unit, and you wanted to get the Infestor with pathogen glands, of course, rush that puppy out, and really fuck people up with fungal growth. It was instant, it did bonus damage to armored at the time, and the Infested Terran was way better because it utilized upgrades, the egg was stronger and more sturdy. It was just a better unit. It's almost hard to sit here and talk about the Infestor and its entire history, because all we really need to know for this cast is people didn't really discover it was very powerful until 2012. And of course these games were in 2011. We can see again the Protoss player is taking a natural. IdrA's on 2 bases. He's getting a Roach Horn as well as Ling Speed. He's pumping drones. And again, Kiwikaki is going for a mostly pylon-centric wall-off here. IdrA is a little bit ahead in workers, but it is the completely standard, oh, I'm Zerg, I should be ahead in workers look. Thankfully, he does have a 3rd on the way. And this map will be very interesting to see what the players go for. This is the ace match. Whoever wins this game wins the first IPL, which, if you don't know, this was actually sort of a big deal when it first came out. These tournaments like the NASL, the IPL, MLG, these weren't flash in the pan gimmick tournaments. They weren't Ascension, you know what I mean? These were tournaments that meant something. Whenever you had one of these trophies in your trophy case, you actually said to yourself, oh wow, I won that event. I went through some serious players to earn that title. And the fact that, IPL and MLG and NASL sort of just threw away all their StarCraft VODs other than some poorly uploaded YouTube shit they haven't worried about in 7 years is pretty disgusting. Because all of these organizations pretty much advertised the fact that they were supposed to have these VODs up on their website, and that, essentially the VODs would be easy to find. Ooh, everyone, come to our website and watch our VODs on our website. Don't go to YouTube. Don't support other commentators. Just make sure you go to our website. That's all they were concerned with, is driving traffic. And what do you know? 2 years later, every single StarCraft VOD has been deleted without warning. And that's part of why I do the Venomous Classic series. Anyone who thought to themselves, whoa, IdrA had these significant accomplishments, and I want to be able to see them. I want to be able to see how high skill level the games were. I want to be able to see if he just lucked into it, or he played bad players, or if he really deserved it. As we see an absolutely laughable one-gas third base on this map. This is how much of a joke the game was back in this time, where it was sort of like, oh, well, if we're going to make a map where Zerg isn't at a disadvantage, like, well, the third can't have a gas. Like, usually they had rocks on thirds, so Zergs had to make units to take their third instead of, the other races are just naturally making units because they don't have to lose workers to do that. Which, by the way, if that offends you or upsets you, you're just exceptionally dim and don't know how the game works. Because that's the whole fucking point. Zerg is trying to squeeze out as many drones as possible instead of attacking units. Because, as I said before, the hatchery bottlenecks your production. And for Terran and Toss players, it's no big deal to kill rocks on a third. But for a Zerg player, it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to go up to a certain amount of drones, and then I'm going to make a bunch of attacking units that are fucking worthless, just so I can take my third. It was a huge deal back in the day, and it didn't really change until around mid-2012 when we saw the map Condemned Ridge, which was pretty much never played and largely forgotten about. But originally the map Condemned Ridge had rocks on the third, and due to a large community outcry, they got rid of the rocks, and then we didn't really see rocks on a third again. But it's something to note because Terminus as a map, the defining factor of it is pretty much like, oh, well, this third doesn't have rocks and it's sort of easy to take. Oh, but it's only one base, like, or it's only one gas. Like, we couldn't fucking, let you have a double gas base. God forbid. Like, it was just very weird to see the way that maps were designed back in this time. And of course the 4 towers in the middle that pretty much scopes out the majority of the map. Absolute nonsense. So it looks like IdrA's going for drops again. Kiwikaki's going for Hallucinate and Robo Style. Great move by IdrA to continuously force Kiwikaki to multitask. This is some Protoss players, if you just run right into where they expect you to run, and they have sentries, and you don't have Ravagers because they don't exist yet, it's goddamn nearly impossible to win. If you run into where they expect, and they have sentries, yeah, you're fucked. But if you drop in multiple locations, you can really screw with them because you put them in a position where they have to choose. They have to choose in an instant about what's more important. They have to choose in that instant whether you're going to be attacking your front door or they're going to be bringing more stuff through the air. It's very difficult for Protoss players to deal with, especially without Stargate. And back in this time, we saw way more straight into Robo play, way less Stargate play because you didn't have joke units like the Oracle. So Roach drop here. Thankfully, double cannon is out for Kiwikaki. And with a little bit of droppage here for IdrA, he's not actually going to do any damage. Kiwikaki was ready for it, and suddenly our Zerg macro machine is going to go into Roach Hydra. He's actually going to get Roach speed and +2. Pathogen glands and Hive, of course, are just completely standard. He should have gotten Roach speed a long time ago. That was probably a mistake. Both economies are very solid for both players. I'm sort of curious as to why the Protoss hasn't just added a Stargate, because all it takes is one Stargate, one Phoenix, and a Shift A move command to never be worried about drops for the rest of the game. And for Kiwikaki to sit there and like make cannons behind his mineral line, like it's just definitely inefficient. Speaking of inefficient, we can see about 5 force fields going down into a space where 3 force fields could have accomplished the same job, and butchering half the Zerg army. Remember, there's no Ravager. Zerg can't do shit against that. And IdrA's going to drop again, taking advantage of the wide airspace on Terminus. And Roach Hydra's fighting against Stalker Immortal Colossus. IdrA's going to continue to retreat. It looks like the Protoss player is having a little bit of trouble here, and IdrA's just going to keep pressing forward, but the Gateway army gets thinned out as the Protoss player Kiwikaki had to warp in a bunch of shit at home. And IdrA's in a position where he's stutter stepping on top of the Colossus. There are the 5 Stalkers that, along with a couple other units, could have been the difference. But because of IdrA's harass, he forced Kiwikaki to make a mistake. And now IdrA's at a huge supply advantage. He's cooking on 4 bases. He looks poised to take this IPL finals, as at this point he's not just going Roach Corruptor and slamming his face into a hard Sentry wall in. He has Roaches and Hydra with better upgrades, better economy, more bases, and he's doing this move earlier on in the game. This isn't a sort of stubborn, oh I'm behind, I'm just gonna run my Roach Corruptor into my opponent's army and die. No, he's really making his opponent work for it. And as he kills the 4th base, things are going to be very difficult here for Kiwikaki, as the player that we've been told ad nauseum only gets frustrated when he gets behind and makes silly decisions, has formulated a brilliant comeback in this best of 5 with both cheese and macro play. The 4th game is frankly one of my favorite I've seen from IdrA, because as someone who always talks about their own macro ability and their ability to make people multitask, it was very nice to see IdrA. Fucking retarded Spotify. It was very nice to see IdrA get in this position where he was forcing his opponent to multitask. And we can see there was a relatively large drop in the main that didn't do a whole lot, but the drop at the natural is doing some damage. And Kiwikaki's in this position where he's basically moving his whole army around to deal with multi-pronged drop harassment. IdrA here really doing a good job of the harassment. Unfortunately, his Roaches there were in range of the 2 cannons. Now, if IdrA had managed to actually hide those Roaches, it just would have been absolutely insufferable for the Protoss player. And as it stands, notice that IdrA has about 5 base saturation with drones on all of them, and he's consistently trying to goop up and prevent the other bases. IdrA knows that if he prevents the Protoss player from taking more than 3 bases, he will be able to stall them out. And even though he is dropping a lot, these are Roach drops. These aren't like Baneling drops that kill, 8 workers and then disappear or something. These are drops that are going in, doing damage, and coming out. And when I say coming out, I mean they're fucking dying. They're dying a horrible death, and only the overlords live. With Lings, +1 Carapace, and Adrenal Glands on the way, I'm really feeling for IdrA here, especially because he has Broodlords. And anytime you're a Protoss player and your best answer to Broodlords is to, blink under with Stalkers, it's pretty shitty. And it looks like Kiwikaki might just go for a screw it push here. He's taking a 4th mid-map. Roach Broodlord. Now the Broodlords are vulnerable, But with massive roach laying out, it wasn't actually a good engagement for Kiwikaki, because without sentries, his Colossus can just get rolled over. Although it does barely live with any health, and IdrA's thought better of it, he's going to run into the main. This is one of the best things you can do versus a Protoss who doesn't want to fight you, is force the engagement onto them. And we can see IdrA with a huge fungal here. That's a big deal because with Blink Micro, Kiwikaki was really in the driver's seat. But as it stands with this counter, IdrA's just going to do tremendous damage to the Protoss player's economy while he distracts him at the front door. Kiwi's about 50 workers behind. Do you think IdrA gave a shit about those Roaches or Lings? Hell no. He's pretty much outright won the original IGN Pro League. Pretty much all that's left for Losira is the crying. And if we look at Losira's playment history, it's pretty predictable. He's going to go Robo. He's going to go Colossus. He's going to do these very basic things, although I will say he definitely didn't make enough observers. That's something that a lot of players even today sort of neglect, is you really should have like at least 3 observers in almost every matchup. IdrA's just going to continue to walk over Kiwi here. The supply advantage is absolutely crushing. Kiwikaki GG's, and IdrA wins the tournament. Subscribe for more Venomous Classics.